As we had this morning a final talk about mission, we will end this afternoon also with a talk on mission. As we heard this morning concerning Psalm 119, God is not only concerned with our eyes, our lips, our head, our heart, our hands, but also with our feet. And missionaries go. They have been somewhere. Dr. Paul Martindale is a missionary serving with pioneers as Islamic ministry consultant and director of the Summer Institute on Islam training program. He and his wife, Michelle, studied under Dr. Christy Wilson here at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary before going to North Africa in 1983. And so Paul is on loan to Gordon-Conwell and serves as ranked adjunct assistant professor of Islamic studies and cross-cultural ministries. And among the courses he teaches here is theology of Islam and implication for ministry to Muslims. I think you have not been teaching Arabic, although I'm sure you could do that as well. So welcome, Dr. Paul Martindale.
Thank you, Eckhart. I actually did teach Arabic a couple of times to small groups of 2 or 3 students. Communicating the gospel in other cultures and among people of other world religions often leads to dialogues in which both sides are enriched. People of other cultures ask different questions from different worldview perspectives. Many times in the process of listening to their questions, we see for the first time new aspects of a theological issue, enlarging our understanding and giving us a perspective beyond the limits of our culturally bound understanding. In its engagement with the world, mission sometimes creates theology, sometimes new insights confirm existing biblical scholarship, and often new areas are identified that must be examined from new angles of inquiry. This has been true in dialogues with Muslims over the years, and what I intend to present is a comparison of grace and works within the 2 theological systems of Islam and Christianity. It's my hope that this case study will show how the fruit of Reformation theology has been applied in the case of works and grace in a modern Muslim context. The role of works. One principle of effective witness with Muslims is listening and allowing them to identify the issues that they find important. It's then up to us to formulate our biblical understanding for them in response to their questions. At a dialogue meeting between Muslims and Christians on the topic of salvation, the role of works became central in the ensuing discussion. The 2 main objectives being expressed by the Muslims present centered upon the apparent lack of works necessary for salvation in Christianity and the carte blanche Christians seem to have for sin in their lives after conversion. The easy grace of God in Christianity for the believer appeared to these Muslims as a license or excuse for sinning, since it can so easily be forgiven without working for it, sin without penitence. This was a principle that they did not find congruent with Islam and which they could not accept as an expression of authentic biblical Christianity. After listening to their objections, we were able to formulate the following description to portray the role of works in salvation and show them that grace was not an automatic excuse for the Christian to sin without regard of the consequences. Both the Muslims and the Christians present were in agreement on the following formulation for the role of works. So in Islam, faith plus works plus Allah's mercy equals salvation. And in Christianity, faith plus grace equals justification plus works. In Islam, the combination of 3 things results in salvation: the faith of the believer, the works or deeds of the believer, and Allah's mercy at the point of judgment. Islam teaches Muslims that they will stand on their own on Judgment Day and that their good deeds must outweigh their bad deeds. In Christianity, the role of works is on the other side of the equation. For the Muslim, works are an instrumental part contributing to their salvation. For the Christian, works grow out of justification as a response to the grace one has received from God. Quoting from Romans 3:28, we explain that we are justified by faith apart from observing the law. Citing verses from James chapter 2, we contended that works will be demonstrated in the life of the believer as a normal consequence of regeneration. James states that someone who claims to be saved but does not demonstrate a changed life has a dead faith. Thus, works is the evidence of authentic conversion and accompanies conversion, even though works plays no instrumental role in earning our justification. Thus, justification plus works must both appear together in the believer's life as an authentic sign that the faith plus grace on the other side of the equation are genuine. As a result of this formulation, the Muslims present were able to see that the role of works is taken seriously in Christianity, since works is the fruit and the evidence of justification and submission to God. Our Muslim friends were also able to see that the Christian does not have a blanket permission for sinning at will, as this would call into question the veracity of the person's salvation, as well as his or her submission to God. For the Christian, works are the sign of an authentic conversion. It also leads to assurance of salvation that's absent in Islam. Therefore, a biblical theology of works as the evidence and assurance of salvation in the believer's life may be very attractive to a Muslim who is seeking to understand and compare his or her faith to our own. On the flip side, it was obvious that the Muslims present at the dialogue meeting did not respect a Christianity where works have no role or importance in salvation. Since works are so important in the Muslim's life, they needed to compare this to Christianity as a primary criterion, and were not able to take seriously a Christianity where the view of grace overwhelms and obscures the necessity of works. Now, much of the Muslims' misunderstanding on this point may be a result of contact with nominal Christianity. A more formal and ritualized practice of Christianity might be more attractive to many Muslim seekers than what they see as the loose and careless, informal Christian practice of most Westerners. Viewing us through their Islamic framework, they often equate this with a lack of commitment and dedication and call into question the authenticity of the Christian faith, reinforcing their view that Islam was given to replace and update a corrupted Christianity. Our dialogue with Muslims has forced us to clarify our theology of works. The biblical emphasis that we place on faith and grace and salvation is certainly appropriate. However, that's not true when it's taken to the extent that the role of works in the life of the believer is ignored or becomes extinguished in our theology or our praxis. For Muslims, this is a central issue, and they needed to see how the role of works is affirmed in Christianity. Therefore, it's essential we understand the role of works clearly and are able to articulate this well with Muslims in a way that helps them take Christianity seriously. Islam's concept of salvation. In order to discuss the concept of grace in Islam, we must first understand Islam's concept of salvation and search for equivalent words for grace. In Islam, the idea of salvation is expressed in the Arabic word falah, which means well-being, welfare, prosperity. The meaning of falah is that salvation is accomplished within history in the Islamic nation or ummah. Salvation was accomplished by Allah sending down his revelation and establishing his true religious community. It is granted to a person when he joins that community and lives according to the religious law. Religious, political, and social action is seen as Allah's saving work. Salvation is only consummated when, at the judgment, Allah forgives a man or woman his or her sins on the basis of deeds they performed according to the law and of his or her reliance upon God. The Islamic view of salvation differs radically from that of the Bible. This we've seen in the choice of this word falah, meaning well-being, rather than the Arabic word halas. Halas would be the word closest to the biblical idea of salvation, meaning payment, deliverance, liberation, or fida, which signifies redemption. Islam denies that man needs to be saved in the biblical sense of salvation from sin's guilt or power. Hence, the key elements of the biblical doctrine of salvation are excluded. The concepts that are in Arabic that are similar to biblical salvation could be carried by several words. Halas, we've mentioned, fida, redemption, najat, to save, be rescued, delivered, etc. However, despite the presence of these equivalent words in Arabic for salvation, the word Islamic theology employs for grace is the word rahmah, or mercy. This is the primary way that Muslims think in terms of the salvation of the individual. After declaring their public witness, the shahada, and cultivating good deeds, the Muslim believer then hopes that Allah will decide to be gracious or merciful to them at the time of judgment. The choice of the word rahmah is directly related to the Islamic doctrines of mankind and sin, which we need to take a brief look at. The problem of sin and what the corollary concept of grace is rooted in the doctrine of man and sin in Islam. According to Islam, man was created basically good, but a little weak and forgetful. Adam's sin in the garden is therefore considered a lagish or a slip or a mistake without irada or deliberate intentionality. For a sin to be serious, it must have been done deliberately. Even then, good works can outweigh intentional sin. The mercy of Allah is therefore a matter of whether the sin is counted against the person or not. Compared with the doctrine of sin in Christianity, the sinfulness of human nature is not a problem that requires divine help in Islam. Man is basically good and he can save himself by his own works if he's attempting to live in submission to Allah's revealed law. In Islam, human nature is intrinsically good. Therefore, mankind is said to be born Muslim, or already submitted by nature. Muslims vehemently reject the Christian teaching that mankind is sinful by nature. If sin is not serious and mankind is not sinful, then a costly grace that satisfies divine justice is not required. What then really is rahmah or mercy in Islam? It is the decision or whim of Allah at the point of judgment to either accept the believer's works or not, and whether to hold the Muslim believer accountable for their evil deeds or not. The concept of mercy in this context is reduced to Allah looking the other way for the sins of some and not for others. Allah is free to do as He wills in each particular case without being held to a standard or reference of justice or righteousness, because His ways are inscrutable and His nature is unknowable. This doctrine is closely associated with two other Islamic teachings concerning human nature, which can be subsumed under the belief in man's perfectibility. The first is Islam's belief in the essential goodness of man and its concomitant rejection of the biblical doctrine of a moral fall. According to Hamdullah Abdulati, quote, "The idea of original sin or hereditary criminality has no room in the teachings of Islam. man, according to the Quran and to the Prophet, is born in a natural state of purity or fitra, that is, Islam or submission to the will and the law of God. Whatever becomes of man after birth is a result of external influence and intruding factors, unquote. To achieve perfect submission to Allah, it's believed that a person only needs divine guidance that enables him to know the will of Allah and live in obedience to it. Muslims reject the Christian teaching that mankind needs salvation from sin. In evangelical Christianity, mankind is created in God's image, but separated from the life of God and intrinsically sinful. God created man in his own image and like him without sin. However, by his decision to disobey, man submitted himself to Satan rather than to God, was separated from the life of God, and his nature became marred by sinfulness. Consequently, he is subject to the wrath of God and to death. He is in no way able to merit his salvation by his own efforts, or as Augustine put it, he is, quote, not able not to sin, unquote. Three important conclusions follow from our belief in original sin. Contrary to what Islam teaches, mankind is not born Muslim, human nature is not perfectible in this life, and divine guidance is not sufficient to make a person submissive to God's will. No one will reach perfection until the resurrection of the body at the second coming of Jesus Christ. The predicament of mankind is much more serious than Islam imagines. By denying the witness of their conscience to the law written on their hearts, Muslims are repressing the knowledge that they have by nature. Several aspects of the doctrine of Allah in Islam bear directly on the Muslims' understanding as well. Allah is absolutely free and unrestricted, even in the realm of truth and morality. He is free to abrogate the truth or obligations of earlier revelations by subsequently revealed truths and obligations. He is free to judge the same act to be good in one circumstance and evil in another according to the situation, although in principle acts are good or evil according to whether they are commanded or forbidden in the Quran. The criteria by which Allah judges and assigns man his destiny are unknowable to man. He's free to forgive the sinner or to condemn him. He is free to do opposites, quote, as he pleases, unquote. Allah is not holy or righteous in the sense of loathing and separating himself from sin. In Islam, the moral attributes of holiness and righteousness are not applicable to Allah, for this would imply likeness to man and would compromise Allah's transcendence. For Islam, Allah is separated from man because he's totally different from him, a metaphysical separation, not because he is holy and man is sinful, a moral separation. Hence, man's separation from God, which according to the Bible is abnormal and intended to be temporary, is considered by Islam to be normal, absolute, and eternal. Allah is unknown and unknowable to man both in this life and the next. Now, the word that the Quran uses to describe the action of Allah in the salvation of the individual is rahmah, which can be translated as mercy, kindness, and compassion. Allah is described as the Rahman, the merciful, the kind, the forgiving. Another of the 99 names of Allah is Ar-Rauf, the gracious, the one who bestows boundless clemency, tenderness, and affection. Rauf is described as the ultimate limit of rahmah, mercy. However, in light of the doctrine of Allah, this mercy is limited in its application to some and not to others as Allah wills. This mercy is not applied consistently with regard to any standard of justice, righteousness, or holiness. As we've seen, the theological differences with Islam that come into play for our discussion are the following. The fall of man included a moral separation from God. Man's nature became corrupted as a result of the fall. Man is unable to save himself by his own works. The seriousness of sin is rooted in the nature of God. God cannot excuse or overlook evil. All sin in the Bible is against God. In addition, submission in Islam and Christianity are different. Submission is the path to salvation in Islam. However, in Christianity, submission happens after union with Christ and justification, and is evidenced through good works that are done in response to God's grace, rather than to earn it. The role of grace. In the simplified formula that we diagrammed earlier for the Muslims present, we stated that in Christianity, faith plus grace equals justification plus works. This was sufficient for the initial presentation of this concept to Muslims, but I would like to expand on this formula and present the following equation. That you have it there. Faith plus grace leads to justification plus works, which leads to salvation. In the process of redemption, faith plus grace leads to the state of justification plus the presence of works as the evidence of a genuine conversion and justification. Salvation will be determined on the basis of whether our works are genuine, reflecting the true state of justification from the grace we have received in Christ. John Piper says it this way, quote, "I believe in the necessity of a transformed life of obedience to Jesus by the power of the Spirit through faith as a public evidence and confirmation of faith at the last day for all who will finally be saved," unquote. Or we might just simply say that the state of our post-justification works are the basis for our final judgment. Justifying faith is not merely alongside good works, but it's also the agency employed by the grace of God to give rise to good works. We can wholeheartedly affirm sola gratia, that salvation comes only by grace. The fact that faith is the vehicle through which grace is applied to us, and that post-justification works are the basis of judgment, does not in any way undermine that the sole foundation of justification is the unmerited grace of God through the atoning work of Christ. The differences between Islam and Christianity in the understanding of grace and works can be traced to the different views in the doctrine of God, the doctrine of mankind, and the doctrine of sin. These doctrines in the Islamic theological system serve to obscure and undermine the need for salvation by grace through the atonement. Since mankind is thought to be basically good, without original sin, and perfectible, the need for redemptive atonement is denied. In Islam, we observe a salvation without justification by faith and a mercy without justice. Conclusions. In the Christian understanding, all people will be judged by the same standard, according to our works. And at the same time, no one will be saved upon the basis of our works. God's mercy is that we do not receive the penalty and judgment that our sins deserve, and that a way has been provided for the redemption of everyone. This mercy comes to us as a result of the costly and perfect sacrifice through the unlimited atonement of Christ. God's mercy does not come at the expense of justice or independently from it. Justice and mercy are both completely satisfied. At the root of Christianity's justification is a costly grace, perfectly meeting all of the requirements of divine justice. In Islam, mercy is applied unevenly as Allah wills, without any reference to Allah's righteousness, holiness, or justice, which are deemed unknowable. It is also applied by a weakening of the seriousness of sin, a denial of original sin from Adam and Eve, and an unrealistically high view of mankind. The theological system of Islam is in denial of man's depravity, man's rebellion against God, the seriousness of sin, and the justice and righteousness of a holy God. 500 years ago, Christianity in Europe was captive to a corrupt state church where indulgences were sold, forgiveness for sins was by works of penance and obedience to the church. A renewed understanding of the costly divine grace broke the European church out of this model and gave birth to the stream of Reformation. Islam is still waiting for its reformation. The superiority of grace in missions is that our works come in grateful response to the wonderful and undeserved justification that is imputed to us and which we were not capable of attaining ourselves. The superiority of grace in missions is that our works done in obedience are empowered by the Holy Spirit living within us, and therefore they are able to give God glory, since they originate in the work of the Spirit within us. The superiority of grace in missions is that our post-justification works are a worship to God, thanking Him for His grace to us. The superiority of grace in missions is that our work serve to make God's grace visible in the world around us. The superiority of grace in missions is that this mercy has perfectly satisfied all the requirements of divine justice and righteousness, and has therefore made our salvation sure. This is much more than human constructs of mercy. Sola gratia. This is a divinely wrought grace that has come down to us, which lives in us, which produces works of righteousness, and which points others to a loving, just, righteous, and merciful God. Thank you.